Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here so early. And I'm going to briefly describe to you the traditional Pakistan breakfast that we have. And it's good to see the room almost filled up. Hopefully some more people will join us. We have a good panel of speakers here. We have Mr. Ross Perot Jr., and I'm grateful to him because as the president of East-West Industries, I'm a colleague of his on the board. And besides that, of course, he's the chairman of the Perot companies. Then we have Francis Matthew, who is the editor-at-large at Gulf News, has a very good view of the region. And I requested him, and he kindly agreed to be here among the panel. We have with us Ambassador Zamir Akram, Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations. And obviously, he sits in a cockpit where he deals with the United Nations, and he has a large overview of what's going on, not only in the region, but in the international circles as such. My son, Zarar, will do the comparing. The format that we'll follow is that we will start off with Ambassador Zamir Akram. Then we'll have Francis Matthew, followed by Ross Perot Jr. And then what we'll do is we'll have a question-answer session. After the question-answer session, I'll sum up, and we'll go ahead from there. So, Zarar, over to you.
Yes, please. Yes. I'll turn it to Ross Perot, Mr. Perot.
No, I think Ambassador Zamir Akram, and then Francis Matthew, then Ross.
Okay. Ambassador Akram.
Please. Thank you. I was told that I have a very short time to give an overview of Pakistan's foreign policy, so it's going to be really very sketchy, but I hope we can go into some details that interest you. I would say that Pakistan today is confronted with serious challenges, but I think also with tremendous opportunities. The challenges are very obvious. First and foremost, it's the issue of security and dealing with the threat of the TTP, of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, affiliated to Al-Qaeda. And as you all know, I'm sure that over the last 3 or 4 months, we have had a focused operation that has been conducted by the armed forces against the Taliban forces, who have, the leadership at least, has fled across the border into Afghanistan, which is part of the problem that has always existed between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that this border is porous. So people move about freely. We have, in addition to these terrorist issues, issues with Afghan refugees who have been 3 million or so, who've been there now almost 30 years, and they keep moving back and forth across this porous border. Fortunately, the efforts have been successful so far, but it's work in progress, and we still continue to seek a final solution to this terrorist threat that we face from the Taliban. A lot will, of course, depend on how things progress in Afghanistan itself. There's a good beginning there with the elections and a government that has very good relations with us, and so we are hopeful that we will be able to address this issue in a conclusive way. The other challenge, of course, is dealing with our eastern neighbor, and that is India. And here, of course, the challenges are more long-term because of historical reasons. The dispute over Jammu and Kashmir, it still remains unresolved. Then, of course, there are the Indian ambitions. They would like to see themselves playing the role of a regional hegemon, which, of course, causes difficulties with us. And over the last 4 or 5 years, there has been, because of the international dynamics, the strategic context, in which India is increasingly being seen by the Western countries, by the United States, as a counterweight to China and the threat or the challenges that China poses to Western interests. And so, while this may not have a major impact on the Chinese, but the Indian military buildup that has been taking place does pose a very serious threat for us, and that escalates not just in the conventional sense, but also at the nuclear or strategic level. So that's a real challenge that we have to address and manage with the Indians. Of course, then domestically we have our economic challenges. I want to mention something which very few people know, and that is the fact that the cost of this, what we have called the war on terror or counter-terrorism since 9/11, is a phenomenal amount to Pakistan from its own resources, about 80 or $84 billion. And that's a cost that we have paid ourselves. And it's not just opportunity cost, it's real cost. If you take in opportunity costs of other measures that we could have taken to improve our economy, that would increase the amount. And then the other narrative that we need to also put on to recognize is that that there is this largesse that has been given to Pakistan in terms of aid and things. Actually, almost 75% of the assistance, that is called assistance, is actually repayment to Pakistan for so-called coalition support funds, which is amounts of money that we have spent on servicing this counterterrorism effort by NATO and ISAF. So the challenges are deep, but then there are also major opportunities, primarily because of the fact that Pakistan is very strategically located. It can be a bridgehead for trade, commerce, for transportation, for energy sources, across linking South and Central Asia and the Middle East. And one of the positives that has come out in recent times has been the sort of activization of the Pakistan-China corridor, which really builds on Pakistan's strategic location and the benefits that it can have for China to access the Middle East and beyond through Pakistan. This is an opportunity that also can be used and is being used by some Central Asian countries which are landlocked and find a way to the sea through Pakistan. This is also potentially an area which can promote peace and cooperation with India as well as with Afghanistan, because if we see this whole region as being interconnected, then Pakistan's role can be pivotal in promoting this relationship in the whole region and integrating the region as a whole. So I want to stop here with giving this, then we can go into details if you want to ask any questions on it. Thank you.
I can pick up on what Ambassador said. Coming from the regional point of view, Pakistan and the Middle East and the Gulf, the real change has been the arrival of Daesh on the political scene. This terrorism is no longer a nihilist group sitting trying to destroy, offering not very much. They're actually trying to run country. They're trying to run territory. They're taking over and managing local government, managing control of people, and that's a major challenge. They're also operating with exceptional violence, thoroughly frightening people. If I was a citizen of North Iraq and these guys came through my front door, I would be very frightened. And so they have a much greater impact than previously. This is happening in an area where the states have been proved to be hollow. By that I mean that they do not really command the loyalty of their people or sometimes even their institutions. So when there's a major shock, the state simply collapses. Iraq is going through that process, although in some pockets we heard Al-Abadi yesterday talking about what he's doing to stop that. But the Kurds have effectively got their own territory, and Iraq is going through a process of trying to find out, recover, and if it can survive in the rest. Syria has collapsed into a civil war, 3, 4, 5, 10-way civil war, with very little hope of a political solution. The same could happen in Yemen. And I'm certain if I was sitting in charge of Daesh, I would be saying we should take a look at Lebanon and topple them over again. So in this scene where nation states can be taken apart and the loyalties of individuals to that nation state can be overtaken by tribal or religious or sectarian or even regional loyalty, it is very dangerous for a country to lose the ability to inspire its people. That's why in Pakistan, the same question has to be answered. Afghanistan has gone through that process, and just over the border. It collapsed, I can't remember when it fell into the 30 years of chaos. And in the last 10 years since the NATO invasion, at least it's had a moderate amount of stability. I visited there, and they were still fighting. In fact, there they were complaining of the safe havens across the border in Pakistan. You visit Pakistan, they're complaining about the safe havens in Afghanistan. Someone somewhere needs to talk, and I think it's a matter of hope that the Pakistan government is now talking with the new Afghan government and sounding as though they might finally get some kind of coherence across that. In addition to organizing this political structure, which in response to the Middle East events, and I think also what I'm just talking about, the terrorists are moving much quicker than the nation states. It is thoroughly depressing that Secretary of State Kerry is talking about building a strategy. I mean, this has been going on for some time. And the fact that there's two separate coalitions running in Iraq and in Syria with two separate war aims is delightful for Daesh. They're very happy. The final point I'd make is, as Daesh and the extremists control the religious discourse, tolerant Islam needs to speak up for itself. And it's not very good at this. It is a diffuse religion. There's no single leader who can say this is the way to go. But there needs to be a more eloquent definition of 21st century Islam. It is a mistake to let the terrorists define what Islam is and others to sit back. That's why it's interesting what's happening in the UAE, where Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid is talking of the intellectual challenge to Daesh. It's why the coalition in Iraq is talking about defining these sort of social and religious challenges to the terrorists, which is as important as the military response. I think I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Mr. Perot, talk for a little bit, and then we can open it up for questions.
Good. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here early on a Saturday morning. And Ikram, thank you for inviting me. Ikram is a great long-term friend. He's a very active member of the East-West Institute. I'm chairman of the East-West Institute. And Ikram and I have had some very good times together. If you read his book that he'll pass out after this, you'll realize Ikram's a very good helicopter pilot. And he flew the helicopters in the Army. So Ikram comes to visit, and I said, well, I'll surprise him. And so we picked him up at DFW Airport. I put him right into the helicopter in the front seat. I said, okay, good luck. And after 40 years, Ikram took off and flew very well. I was terribly impressed. He has not lost his touch at all for being a good helicopter pilot. At the East-West Institute, in addition to business activities I have throughout the Middle East, we're very active in Abu Dhabi, we're very active in northern Iraq and Kurdistan. And we've been active in Kurdistan since 2006, working with the Barzani family in the oil and gas business, in an area that I'm very pleased with the progress and excited about the potential for that part of Iraq. If you look at the East-West Institute, we are an NGO. We operate around the world. And our founder, John Morose, is a great man of peace. And he started this institute over 30 years ago. And John's role was developing the Track 2 negotiation channels between the major powers of the world. He started off, and his main focus was U.S. and Russia during the Cold War. And John and the East-West Institute played a critical role allowing governments to communicate in an informal manner. And I'm always amazed as I watched how these big public bureaucracies have a difficult time communicating with each other. And John came in and filled that gap. So today we have our Russia program was very strong, and then at the end of the Cold War it faded away. And right before John passed away last year, he was back on the field, really developing a whole new Track 2 program with Russia because of the importance of U.S.-Russia and the gap in relationships we have today between the United States and Russia, which I think is a critical problem that Andrew and I were talking about earlier, that we need to plug with the Track 2 process. We then have been very active in China. And I'm always surprised how, back at our heyday, when John was alive, the Chinese government would call John. They said, look, our president's going to come to Washington. We've talked to State Department, we've talked to Defense, we've talked to the White House. We're very confused on what the agenda should be. He said, can you go sort out between the branches of the U.S. government exactly what we should focus on? So in an informal, unofficial way, we can deliver very difficult messages back and forth between the countries. And it's become what I call it a strategic charity. If we can help maintain relationships between the major powers in the world, those are dollars very well spent. And this is all privately financed. So these are our board members and our donors that give private money to help this public process of Track 2. And that leads me into the Abu Dhabi process. Abu Dhabi was very focused on Pakistan and Afghanistan and what would happen after NATO leaves Afghanistan. What kind of void is left? And so through the Abu Dhabi process, we've been working, helping basically the villages and the areas between Pakistan, Afghanistan, the border areas, maintain and develop a reform program, start the relationships across the border, develop efficient border crossings, and in effect, give this part of the world a chance to survive once the NATO forces pull out. And you realize the economic impact. There's never a positive, you never want to go to war. That's something we all work very hard to avoid. But when the United States does go to an area and we do have to fight, we bring literally tens of billions of dollars of economic development into that area. We hire the local people, we build the roads, we build the schools, and so when we pull out, there's always an economic void. And so the Afghan process is helping us figure out how do we let the Afghans and the Pakistanis get on their feet and have a real economy so when the forces are gone, they have a chance to move forward in a peaceful manner. And we have Martin from our Brussels office is with us today, who's been very active in the Afghan process. So if we want to focus on that area, I might put Martin on the field and let him go all into the details of how we've made that work. But thank you very much. Ikram, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
I guess we'll open up the floor for questions, but maybe we'll start with one sort of just observation, and perhaps for the press as well and media. There's obviously a focus on sort of terrorism and how part of the youth has got marginalized. But it's interesting to me, there's been wonderful things being done in Pakistan from a technology perspective. A substantial portion of the population is below 25, I think approximately 70%. So over the coming years, actually, it'll be one of the few populations in the world where the working population will be greater than the retired population. So you have a great opportunity over here from a market perspective, a growing middle class. A lot of effort has been going into sort of software development. The services industry is booming. But, when you pick up a newspaper outside of Pakistan, you don't see a lot of it. And, perhaps maybe from your perspective, being closer in the UAE, you can shed some light on that.
No, we're certainly guilty of having too many bad headlines of Pakistan. That's the case. Opening a primary school is a difficult headline compared to an attack. But it's a mistake to make news into a body count because it ends up being very destructive. And sometimes I talk back in the office, these endless 10s and 20s and 30s of dead people are not what the story is about. I think you're right, that the story is about the long-term development and the way some good things are happening. The problem is that has to go with a pretty active political program. I mean, some of the sort of grassroots work in order to educate, challenge, and give opportunity to young people, or anybody, to make them interested in staying where they are and developing a normal, seeing their ambitions for their families, which is so important, has to also run with a political program which inspires them. Even at some remote stage, you see the flag and you say, I'm happy to be here. And unless the twin run, it's going to be quite difficult, because eventually nation states have to defend themselves. And that means that either the policeman is trusted, or the army is trusted, or someone with a gun somewhere defends themselves, and the rule of law is maintained, but in the background there has to be a way of enforcing that. So unless you have both arms, the sort of economic and social development, along with trust in the rule of law and the enforcement of that, things go wrong.
Perhaps, Ambassador, for you, I mean, we've seen a more active civil society in Pakistan. And, there are a lot of, obviously, a very active judiciary, and obviously a lot of decisions that perhaps people aren't happy with, and, people sort of, but a very important component of a sophisticated, maturing society is a strong judicial system. And maybe you can just talk about, what's happening in Pakistan in terms of sort of civil society reforms, perhaps what the government is doing to encourage it, maybe some of what's been discussed in terms of institutional sort of forays and, programs in order to sort of empower people, at the lower level and so forth, so they have the confidence to actually go out and, do better things.
Well, I think civil society in Pakistan has been a real backbone for the country, and being ambassador in Geneva to the UN, I deal a lot with humanitarian issues. And it is not just the government, but to a large extent the civil society in Pakistan, which has helped us to deal with some major natural calamities, such as the floods in 2010, and before that in 2005 the earthquake, which were major calamities. But also with operations that, law enforcement operations in the northern areas or in FATA, where people have been displaced. Again, civil society has come to the forefront in helping out with this in a very big way. They are also involved in various areas, development, socio-economic development, education, food, all these are areas where the civil society has made tremendous and continues to make tremendous contributions. Judiciary, and you didn't mention the media.
Right.
But the media and the judiciary are really active players now. And for the first time in many years, since the existence of Pakistan, governments have actually been toppled. I mean, you had a prime minister being removed by the chief justice, which is phenomenal for a country like Pakistan. And the media, on the other hand, has sort of, I would say, it's hyperactive in terms of projecting corruption, in terms of projecting mismanagement. If you've been seeing the media over the last few days, you've seen the criticism of the government of the mishandling of the petroleum crisis. So these are all these organizations or these institutions have brought about greater transparency in the country.
It's an important point regarding the media, because I think if you go to sort of traditional definitions of freedom of press, at least sort of the US constitutional view, the Pakistan press is actually one of the freest in the world, because if you open any newspaper, it's all criticizing the government. I mean, it's, and it's unbelievable, actually. I would say the US press is much more restrained in its criticism of US governmental actions, at least in initial stages, than the Pakistani press, which is sort of, I think if you're in power, you're sort of open season these days.
It's not just a free press, it's a free-for-all.
It's a free-for-all, that's true. Mr. Perot, maybe we can talk about, and I realize you don't obviously represent the US government in any capacity, but we talk about US foreign policy a little bit, and specifically towards Pakistan. I guess to put it charitably, it's been an interesting relationship over the last.
I think it's been an interesting relationship, but it's a very important relationship for our country. And I think it's important that the United States and Pakistan really build that relationship and get this relationship right. And I think we have to recreate a lot of the bridges we used to have that have been a little frayed through the years. Our militaries used to be very close, and we want to continue that military relationship. We used to bring a lot of young Pakistani officers to the United States to go to our war colleges, and they went to our pilot training programs, and then vice versa. Our officers would come and train in Pakistan. That has to come back alive. Our intelligence services have to continue to work well together on the war on terror. And then our governments and our State Departments certainly continue to focus on Pakistan. And I know we put very strong ambassadors into Pakistan to build those relationships. But at the end of the day, being a businessman,
Yes.
not a diplomat, the most important thing we can do in the United States is to encourage American business to go to Pakistan. And we have been in India now for 20 years. Our old Perot Systems team, and now we're reinvesting in India. And as we're building our software centers in India, before we sold our company to Dell 5 years ago, we were actively going to build software and development centers into Pakistan. Right. And we were actually looking at Lahore. And we saw great potential in Lahore, working with the Pakistani people to build very good data and delivery centers out of Pakistan. So I think I would like to see more encouragement from our country to go into Pakistan, to bring our jobs, to bring our capital, to hire the Pakistani people. And I think the best thing we can do as businessmen to fight the war on terror is to bring jobs and hope into communities around the world. And to do that, I told our government when we went into Iraq, I said, what you should do is make all of Iraq a free enterprise zone or a tax-free zone. And you should tell all American business, anything you do in Iraq for the next decade, the companies you build, the investments you make, you'll have a tax holiday. And I think if we'd done a program, I told the State Department, I said, if you did that, you'd be shocked at the hundreds of American companies that would come over and help start businesses in Iraq. And if we had done that, I think you wouldn't see the Iraq we have today. Instead, you'd see a growing Iraq, you'd see prosperity. And I think, again, a businessman, if we can bring good jobs into a community, I think the need for the terrorism, a lot of the terrorists would rather go to work, take care of their families, and have a future than to go into this dark world of terrorism.
It's sort of interesting. There was a study done over the last 200 years of terrorists, and the one common factor that they found in every terrorist was they were unemployed. So jobs.
And they don't have. If you look at it, and you talk to our military officials that work through Iraq, they go, and if you look at how we finally were able to settle the Anbar province.
Yes.
We went in, we went to the tribal chiefs and said, okay, how can we help bring peace to your village, peace to your city? And we went to the locals and said, how can we help you? Which is always a critical thing we've got to do. We can't go in with an American view on how these cities or villages should work. And we'd go in, and they as we talked, and so our military commanders said, look, we want to talk to the terrorists. And so the terrorists, we said, we would provide a safe harbor. The terrorists, leaders would come in. And the military told me, they said it was amazing, most of the terrorists want a job. And so we, the U.S. government, we then would hire them. We said, okay, look, you need a job, come in and help us. So that took care of a lot of the terrorists. Yes. And they said, you always had one or two, there's nothing you could do to help them.
Yes.
And then they're the ones that had to be either put in jail or killed. But he said most of the people that are disenfranchised, you can bring them back into civil society.
I think at this point we'll open up the floor to questions. We've got some mics here, so happy to pass them around with any questions. Why don't I give the mic and then we can move it around. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My question to Mr.
Can you
Perot.
identify yourself?
My name is Anjum Jora. I'm a Pakistani Swiss living in Zurich and working for the Swiss companies to develop business with the Middle East and Far East. I was in Pakistan lately, and I met a lot of young students who are very good qualified. They all having difficulties to get their security clearance, especially to US or to Europe. Even they are very highly qualified, very intelligent, but most of the embassies are declining them the visa, even they can afford financially. So my question to you is how we are going to bring this cream of Pakistan closer to the Western culture, because they will be your ambassadors for the next 10, 20 years. So
I get that. I agree. Those are the people-to-people programs that we're going to have to work through. And we had that same problem, I believe, in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And so, through the right diplomatic processes and getting the bureaucracies aligned, we're now able to bring the Saudi students back into the United States. And this is one that we need to do the same thing in Pakistan.
Because all those are pro-Westerns, if they
That's
want to
right.
go to your universities or colleges, whatever. But if you go to the Swiss embassy, that much I know, they're declining almost every second or third. So this creates another depression among the future of Pakistan. A terrorist is there, but a well-educated person, when he goes back from the West, is the right ambassador from all the policies which you may have.
I agree. We both agree on that point. And I think it's so easy for your bureaucracy on this war on terror to say no. It's the easiest thing to do is say no, no, no. So you've got to develop incentives to where the State Department will start to say yes. And I think, one of the better things we can do is provide more and more scholarships to Pakistani students to study in the United States. That, to me, is, with being a U.S. citizen, is the best long-term diplomatic thing we can do, is build friends around the world.
This will be,
The same applies in Europe, where the Schengen countries and the UK have finally got together and given the Gulf states quick visas, including students. It's very important.
what you can do for Pakistan, or what in your limits, what could be done? If my question to you, how we could do this thing better, that those students are not desperate.
Right. I mean,
Thank you.
I can certainly talk to our State Department about it. But I think the best thing would be to make sure it's brought up within the Pakistani leaders need to talk to the State Department to get this resolved. That's what I'd recommend.
Minister,
Yeah, Martin?
yeah.
Oh.
You want?
Good morning. I'm Emil Wies, the Consul General of Switzerland in Karachi. First of all, I would say something very good about Pakistan. When I came to Pakistan, I have been received never as good as in all the countries I have been, and I have been in many countries. So the hospitality, I think you're world champion. And here we talk about the image. Who knows that the corporate social responsibility of the company is so amazing, maybe like nowhere in the world. Who knows people like Mr. Edie from the Edie Foundation, exceptional people. And all this image, all these positive factors are never somehow distributed to abroad. And I think this is one of the issues where Pakistan has to work a little bit on it. Because after all, for example, in Karachi last year, 2014, you had 2,200 murders. In the United States, you had 32,000 murders. In Venezuela, you had about 4,000 murders with a much lower population. It's much, much more dangerous. And when you see the countries, the most dangerous countries in the world, or the most dangerous cities, in top 10, there is not Karachi inside, and it's not Pakistan inside. That's as well something, all this information does not go out. You talked about security. Of course, security is a big issue, but it's a symptom. And I think we have to concentrate on the symptoms on one hand, but as well on the causes. Causes is probably good governance, jobs, as you mentioned properly, because you have every 7 seconds you have a young Pakistani born. How do you employ them? So I think these are the questions. What are you going to do to improve the education? So many people are not well educated. You can influence them very well. How do you improve the governments? And how do you make that the foreign companies come to Pakistan? We try our best to do that. And I hope, because Pakistan understands, did some of you read Vision 225 of Pakistan? It's a fantastic booklet. Most of the solutions are basically there, but the implementation takes a little bit, is lagging behind.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes,
Please.
The fact is that the effort to project a positive image or a positive side of Pakistan, like Zirar mentioned, is actually being made. The problem is that there are no takers in the media, and the narrative really focuses on the negative side, because that's a big story, as we just heard. Nobody really wants to give coverage to the fact that Nestle made 150% profit, okay, in Pakistan, which it did. So the negative narrative really gets the headlines, and that's. But the effort to project the positive image is very much there. And hopefully at some point it will succeed in overcoming this negative side.
But if I may defend my profession slightly, there is an issue. And we were talking about the micro and the positives that can be done on the ground. There is a lingering feeling when one looks at Pakistan from outside that there is not a clear there is a split between the military establishment and the civilian government. And we're not certain that they're both operating in the same way. And that creates a lingering feeling that there is something wrong. Now, there's also that thread, which has been there for a while, that parts of the Pakistan establishment did set up the Taliban and supported them. And are they truly clear, finished, and off that track? Or are they keeping them in reserve in case Afghanistan goes down the tubes and they want to have a few friends in the north in the future 10, 20 years' time? So that is part of why there is this problem we've got, which I agree with you should be dealt with. But there is an issue of that long-term feeling of where is Pakistan going?
So that's the problem, because if you go back, the Taliban's creation is the time when the Afghan Mujahideen were created to fight against the Soviets.
Yes.
And as you know, Mr. Osama bin Laden was a recipient of payment and aid from the CIA.
That's right.
We also know, going back, that the Taliban were actually being supported by the US government because they were seen as the only force that could bring peace to Afghanistan. And so it's not simply as easy to say, but that's the problem I said about narrative.
Yes.
The narrative needs to be complete. Where did it start from? Who was really responsible? So I think the West needs to take responsibility for what they did in promoting these very groups that are now causing problems. So that's one example.
I'd just like to add here that there is a feeling in which Francis just now talked about, is that we are sort of keeping the people, our friends in reserve, in case Afghanistan slips out of this thing. A lot of them are in their graves, in reserve. Because if you take in holistically, 5,000 of our soldiers have died, and 20,000 have been casualties, wounded, and 50,000 civilians dead. If you take all the countries in the region and NATO forces, we've had more casualties than all of them put together, including Afghanistan. So I think, it's very difficult to explain this to the Pakistani soldier who's fighting there and dying, that you are supposed to distinguish between a good Taliban and a bad Taliban when you're firing at them, right? So it's a sort of this thing, and I think the last remaining bit was North Waziristan, and I agree that there was a doubt because of the Afghani network, that there was reluctance on the part of Pakistan, and it did, the perception was such. But that perception was because of two reasons. One, because our resources were limited. We have committed almost 40% of our military resources into fighting in FATA and SWAT. And our helicopter resources, our mobility resources, our communication resources. We lack mine-resistant vehicles. We lack infrared devices. We lack, a lot of things which are available across the border in Afghanistan. But having said that, the main thing which I'd like to talk about, which I want to say, is the meeting of the minds between the Afghan military and the Pakistan military because of President Ashraf Ghani. He came to Pakistan in absolute departure from protocol, and without even the Prime Minister, he went straight into GHQ. And he said one thing very revealing. He said, we will not let the past bury the future. Right? So I think we have hope there. And like the Master said, there is a narrative that has to be countered. And we need to counter the narrative. Yes, please. Martin, you've been looking for some time. Martin, please. Let's Martin go. Yes. He's been ignored at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Martin Fleischer, Vice President, East-West Institute, of which Mr. Rospero is the chairman of the board, and Ikram, our very important board member. Thank you for your support, and thank you for inviting me here to this event, which I think embodies Davos' finest, that bringing business and security policy issues so close together. I was struck by Mr. Matthews' introduction because you were from the region of Pakistan and Afghanistan. You jumped right to Daesh, to the Islamic State. And by the way, the East-West Institute also works on the threat of violent extremism. But my question is, what we've seen in Iraq, we have, the Western community has spent billions and years to build up the army, but when the Islamic State, I wouldn't say fired in the air, that would be overdoing it, but aggressed, they ran away and became almost invisible. In Afghanistan, we have invested a lot to build up the army. What is your prediction? I asked the question to you and also to His Excellency, the Ambassador. After the pullout of the Allied forces, the majority of the Allied forces, how likely, and I hope it's not very likely, how likely is an Iraq scenario that Taliban and other forces would fill in the security vacuum and control territories? And I'm looking forward to you saying that we should not be afraid, but I'm not so sure. Thank you.
I think one has to be afraid. I've visited Kabul twice now, and I'm impressed by the strength of civil society. I was quite shocked by the way, talking to people, I was quite shocked by the way there had been such a vacuum for so long. But the last 10 years has built a society which I don't think will go away. So I don't think it's a question in Afghanistan of everything going back to pre-01. It will not happen. Some good things have happened there, and very strong civil society started. Is there going to be a security issue? I'm sure there is. And I think, as Ikram is saying, so the conversations between the Pakistanis and the Afghanis are a very important step forward in making that happen. And so I'm basically optimistic in Afghanistan. It's always a mistake, but bad things happen. But I'm optimistic there.
I think there are three things. The Afghans face three challenges. First is the ability for Mr. Ashraf Ghani and Mr. Abdullah to work together. And that's not just a personality problem, that's a problem between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. The Northern Alliance plus the others to work together. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is, even if they are able to work together, are they in a position, will they be able to reach an understanding with the Taliban? Because the Taliban cannot be wished away. They are there. And so the best case scenario is for the government in Kabul to arrive at some kind of power sharing agreement with the Taliban in some form. That would be the best case. Otherwise, there would be continued fighting between Kabul and Kandahar, or the southern provinces, eastern provinces. And the third problem is external interference. Whether we have talked about Pakistan's interests, Indians have a presence, they have an interest, Iranians have an interest, of course the Americans have an interest, Saudis have a major interest, and then let's not forget the Chinese and the Russians have major interests. So this regional combination of forces has to pull in the same direction to help Afghanistan. Because if it doesn't, then we'll then end up pulling it apart. So these three things, in my view, are really key to the future of Afghanistan.
We'll have one last question, actually. Christoph.
Thank you so much. My name's Blair Glencourse. I run an organization called the Accountability Lab. We work with young people in Pakistan and other parts of South Asia to empower them around issues of integrity and personal responsibility. For change, I also worked with Dr. Ghani for 5 years, and he is an incredible man, and I agree it's a great thing for Afghanistan. If this is the last question, 2 quick points, because there's a couple of big topics I think we haven't touched on entirely. The first for the ambassador is the relationship with India. and how that's changing now with the new Prime Minister there. And the second point is on women. We talk to a lot of young people in Pakistan, and a lot of the best ideas and most creative ideas for building civil society and generating change come from young ladies. Could the panel talk about their role in the future of Pakistan and how that might help build security and stability?
Well, unfortunately, the relationship with India has deteriorated. There was a promising beginning when Mr. Modi won the elections and invited all the leaders from South Asia to his swearing-in ceremony. And at that point, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had a very fruitful, useful meeting with him. Unfortunately, subsequently, for reasons which are difficult for us to understand, the relationship has deteriorated primarily because the Indians unilaterally cancelled the talks that were supposed to have been resumed. And that has been followed up by clashes on the ceasefire line between Indian and Pakistani forces in Kashmir. We are ready to engage, and we are ready to address the concerns that they have, but they should also be ready to engage and address the concerns that we have. There has to be reciprocity in this thing. I briefly mentioned the fact that there is a nuclear or strategic dimension to this relationship now, which makes it absolutely imperative that we manage this relationship and prevent it from becoming spinning out of control. As for the role of women, I think it's an increasingly important role that women are playing in Pakistan, despite efforts by some conservative elements and groups that have tried to, during the period when we had Zia-ul-Haq's government, when he gave this opening to these conservatives. But I think subsequently, during Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto's time, during President Musharraf's time, and women have now started playing a major role in society. They are 50% of the population. They have now, thanks to President Musharraf, entered into areas, professions which traditionally they did not. You would be surprised to know that there are women fighter pilots, and they are not flying transport planes, they're actually flying F-16s. They have participated in combat operations, they have been bombing Taliban targets. So they have come out on their own, and I think they are also, apart from the traditional profession that they have been involved in, like teaching, medicine, lawyers, etc., they are coming into areas such as the police, the civil service, and I mentioned the armed forces. And they are also very active in civil society. That's one of the major things that attracts the role of women. And you'll be surprised to know that every year, when results come out of high school exams or college exams, the percentage of girls who are at the top is much higher than boys. So in the field of education, they're excelling in this field as well.
One last question, please, because we have to clear the room. And Stagenberger is not very...
I'm very grateful. Adam Price, a former member of the British Parliament, and if material inequality in society remains a fundamental cleavage in Pakistan, as it does throughout the world, what do you think is the alternative, ideologically, philosophically, that is available for the poor of Pakistan? Which has a rich heritage, of course, in terms of socialism and alternative ideologies. What do you think is the option for them, for the poor of Pakistan, if that tradition is no longer on the table, if they are not to embrace the option of the Taliban and other, of course, ideologies that many of us in this room would obviously abjure?
Well, alternative ideology you've seen historically, the poor in Pakistan did not opt for socialism, Marxism, communism, whatever you want to call that, alternative, because they have been deeply rooted throughout our history in a particular strain of Islam, which is not fundamentalist, it's not extremist, it's not Salafi, it's not Wahhabi. We broadly call it Sufist Islam, and that is a very strong tradition. And in that tradition, there is no alternative to extremism. So when we talk about the presence of the Taliban or the terrorist groups, yes, part of the problem is there, but if you take the whole country as a whole, then these people are a very, very small minority. And poverty is not something which is limited to a small number of people. Most of the people in Pakistan are poor by international standards. Maybe not as poor as some other countries but they have not opted to this extremist approach as we would expect them to do. I think the reason is that they follow a strain of Islam which rejects this kind of extremism, rejects this kind of tactics which you see from these terrorist groups. So I would say that is really the social reason behind it. I could be wrong, but that's my view.
Thank you. We had a good, I think we've gone 15 minutes over the time I allotted for this thing, but I just want to say, first of all, thank the panel of speakers. Ross, thank you for being here. You cannot understand how tense I was at the controls, and mainly because after 40 years, and I didn't want to be shown up as somebody who didn't know how to fly a helicopter. But Ross, the major thing that you did is the leadership you give to us in EWI, and I always cherish that. That keeps us going to, like you said, to involve ourselves in issues that really matter and behind the scenes, literally. But and particularly the one that Martin and myself we are working on, the Afghan reconnect process. It is tremendous. There's tremendous progress there, and I wish the same thing could we do something with India, because as much as I'm an optimist and as much I cherish my Indian friends, and I really look forward to South Asia, which would be free of fear. But unfortunately, the government in India today is following a track which is really upsetting even the best friends of India, like people like me. I feel very this thing, because if you have the National Security Advisor calling Pakistan the artificial entity called Pakistan and going to inflict disproportionate pain on Pakistan, this is something you would like to hear from a jihadist, not from the National Security Advisor of India. So obviously it worries us, because let me put it to you very bluntly, that their agenda is to turn 1,000 years of Muslim rule back into this thing, which is unheard of. We were not responsible for the 1,000 years of Muslim rule. We want to look at the future of our children. And therefore, if we have a fail-safe line and they cross the fail-safe line, what does the Pakistani commander do? He has got no choice in the face of overwhelming superiority 6-1, 7-1, in the face of our depleted resources, but to employ tactical nuclear weapons. And that we know where it's going to lead. So I think the time has come to step back and talk about friendship and talk about what the future can hold, rather than talk about death and destruction. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here early in the morning on a Saturday, which is a big thing. I'm grateful to Francis. I requested him. Francis had got a terrific view of this thing, and I'm trying to get him to come and lecture at the National Defense University so that he can talk to the people who are this thing. There is a feeling, a perception in this thing which I'd like to clear about the disconnect between the military and the civil. Yes, it is because of an organization entity, because every time the civilian government is in trouble, it turns to the military, right? When there's cyclone or there's earthquake, the military. If there's floods, the military. If there's schools being surveyed, it's the military. If it's polio epidemic, it's the military. If it's so they keep telling me. And now look at the latest. They're asking for military courts, right? Because the judicial system is not working. So it's not because the military wants the military courts, the judicial system is not working. You had people laughing themselves sick in the jails, right? They were convicts running the jails because they had terrorized the jail wardens, etc. And they used to have satellite telephones, etc., walk around the jails and direct entire operations out of jail. So what do you do at such times? So they turn back to the military, and the military has hardly any solutions. Militaries cannot run governments. So I think that what everybody is talking about is to change the narrative, to get the narrative right. And there the media is very important. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Admiral Zaneer. And I am very grateful. Today is a very special day for me for many reasons. My only sister, died about 38 years ago. This was her birthday, January 24th. I was very lucky 2 years earlier to announce the birth of my grandson, who's on January 23rd, the day earlier, and he was 2 yesterday. And tomorrow my daughter, Nefa, will be 30. So we are going through a very interesting 23rd, 24th, 25th. Thank you very much for being here. Please, we have some time before we can break off. We have to leave the room by 5 to 9. So there is breakfast. People who haven't had breakfast, please take the breakfast. I have copies of my book. Anybody who hasn't a copy, please take it. Please take 2 if you want to give to some friend. Please drop a visiting card in that thing. We'd like to know all of you who came. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you.